After one chaotic night, I ended up having a flash marriage with Allan White, a prominent figure in the capital. Publicly, he was noble, aloof, and indifferent, but in private, he tore apart my nightgown every night. On our first wedding anniversary, the woman Allan had loved in his youth suddenly divorced and returned to the country. That night, for the first time since our marriage, he didn't come home. The woman he had once admired said it was her good fortune to look a bit like me. I sat in our wedding room, eyes wide open until dawn. The next day, I sent him the wedding ring along with divorce papers and left a note. "Your skills are actually terrible. Bad review, Allan White. I want a refund." Allan found me later, grabbing my wrist and pulling me out of a drinking party. The capital had just seen its first snow, and I wasn't used to wearing high heels. I almost slipped on the thin snow, but he bent down and picked me up. The Bentley nanny car was already waiting, the partition raised, and the heating was strong. Inside, Allan loosened his tie, took off his suit jacket, and saw me curled up in the car seat, the strap of my slip dress falling off, exposing most of my shoulder. His voice was strained when he said my name. "Cynthia." As the car moved smoothly, I noticed his Adam's apple bobbing intensely, sweat on his forehead, and veins throbbing at his temples. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the drink I had been coaxed into drinking. Or maybe it was simply how perfect Allan looked. I felt unbearably hot and thirsty, like ants were crawling inside me, making me itch. I wanted him to hold me, kiss me, and push me down hard, like in the books. But Allan's self-control was clearly unmatched. He covered me with his suit jacket and said, "I'll take you to the hospital right away. Just hold on." But I didn't want the hospital. I didn't want a doctor. My face was flushed, and all sense had left me. I wanted him to save me now. His suit jacket smelled faintly of tobacco and sandalwood, mixing and making me even more restless. I threw off the jacket and pulled at the other strap of my dress. "Allan, are you not capable?" I asked, my voice taunting. He turned his face away, voice hoarse. "Put your clothes back on. Did you hear me?" But I wasn't listening. I hugged his lean waist, pressing against his firm body. I could feel his heat, and I wanted more. "We're almost at the hospital," he said, but I didn't care. "I don't want to go to the hospital. I want you to help me now." My hand moved lower on his body, and I challenged him again. "Are you really incapable, or just for show?" Allan didn't speak. Instead, he gently touched the corner of my eye. His fingers were long, strong, and his touch made me shiver. It wasn't the cold winter outside anymore, but something warm, humid, and overwhelming. I leaned into his touch. Without a word, he kissed me, and I couldn't help but moan softly. His lips were cool against mine, while my own were burning with desire. "Don't regret it, Cynthia," he warned, but I didn't care. I kissed him back, my fingers clutching his arm as the car moved beneath the starry sky. After that night, I hid from Allan for 3 whole days. But when he finally found me, he said he wanted to take responsibility and marry me. A year has passed since we got married, but I can still remember how wildly my heart beat in that moment. After we got the marriage certificate, Allan took me back to his family's home. It was then that I realized the White family didn't want to accept me. But back then, I was young and impulsive, thinking that as long as Allan treated me well, nothing else mattered. In our first year of marriage, Allan and I were passionately in love. Every night it felt like he couldn't get enough, tearing my nightgowns in his insatiable desire. Except for my physiological period, he never let a single night go by. I secretly thought he must love me, even though he never said those words aloud. Until tonight, our first wedding anniversary, when he lost contact at 5:30 p.m. I called him, but his phone was off. I called his secretary, but she told me his schedule was off limits. I waited alone in our wedding room for hours, calling him 17 times, but his phone stayed off. Later, Allan's cousin Mandy sent me a location. She asked if I wanted to know who her cousin's true love was. I drove to the location, where Mandy was waiting. She led me upstairs, and when we entered the room, the lively atmosphere disappeared. I saw her sitting there, looking at me with a smile, but her eyes were cold. She spoke, her voice laced with mockery. "Are you Allan's little wife, Cynthia Walsh?" Mandy immediately interrupted. "Look, doesn't she look a bit like you, Dora?" Dora smiled faintly and said, "Having a bit of resemblance to me is her good fortune." The people in the room laughed, and Mandy asked, "When is my cousin coming?" Dora smiled shyly. "I'll call and ask." I stood at the door, holding my breath. Allan's phone had always been off, but when Dora dialed it, it connected. She looked at me with barely concealed pride and asked, "Allan, when are you coming? Everyone is waiting for you." I could hear something breaking in the background. The winter in the capital was bone-chillingly cold, and I had rushed out wearing only a thin coat. I felt completely surrounded by the cold, my heart aching with every beat. I was losing it, but I couldn't cry. As I turned to leave, I heard Dora's soft voice. "All right, take your time and drive safely. See you soon." By the time I got home, it was already 11 p.m. Standing in front of the mirror, my hands were still shaking. Allan always liked to hold my face, gently caressing the corners of my eyes. When things got intense, he would kiss the small mole at the corner of my eye repeatedly. My eyes are slightly round with upturned corners and thick lashes. Dora also has round eyes, but the difference is that she has single eyelids while I have double eyelids. The small moles at the corners of our eyes were even in the same spot. I felt the urge to cry, but instead, I just stared at myself in the mirror, a helpless smile forming on my face. I really loved Allan White, but I hated being treated as a substitute. I dialed Allan's number one last time. This time his phone was on, but he didn't answer. A few minutes later, I received a message from him. "Sorry, Cynthia. I have something important tonight. I'll be home tomorrow." I sat on the floor, staring at those 2 short lines of text. The screen went dark, and I suddenly laughed at myself. But cold tears fell onto the screen. Just before dawn, I went to Allan's study, took off my wedding ring, and placed it along with the drafted divorce agreement into an envelope. As I was about to leave, I thought about his absence the night before and Dora's lofty attitude. I couldn't hold back and wrote on a sticky note, "Your skills are actually terrible. 365 days a year, you only know one position in bed. I'm tired of it. You're getting a bad review. Also, Allan White, I want a refund." I called a courier, service to send the envelope to Allan's company, then packed my things and left the marital home. On the way to my best friend's house, Allan's call suddenly came through. I hesitated for a moment, but didn't answer. A moment later, it was hung up from his side. He didn't call again. He had always been like this, aloof, proud, and hard to approach. Only in bed could I glimpse his more human side. Allan put down his phone and called his secretary, telling them to get the driver ready. "I need to go home," he said. The secretary handed over a large envelope. "Mr. White, this was just delivered by a local courier from your wife." Allan pressed his temples, his expression softening for a moment. He reached for the envelope, and when he opened it, the wedding ring he had personally designed fell out first. His expression changed instantly. He picked up the ring and then pulled out everything else from the envelope. When he saw the divorce agreement, his headache from the meeting intensified. But it was the sticky note that caught his attention. "Your skills are actually terrible. 365 days a year, you only know one position in bed." Allan's face grew colder. His skills are terrible? Allan muttered angrily, lighting a cigarette. He laughed bitterly. Did Cynthia forget how she messed up his shirt and trousers? How she shyly covered her face and wouldn't look at him? Allan thought, if Cynthia were in front of him right now, he would grab her by the nape and press her against the floor-to-ceiling window. Even if she cried and begged, calling him honey, it wouldn't matter. He coldly extinguished the cigarette. She really knew how to turn the tables. He waved his hand to dismiss the secretary and tried calling me again, but the call went unanswered. He called a third time, but this time, it didn't go through at all. Meanwhile, the servant from the marital home called and informed him, "Mr. White, we saw on the surveillance that Mrs. White left early this morning, and she deleted her fingerprints from all the door locks." Ellen's headache worsened. "What else did the surveillance capture?" The servant continued, "Oh, right. Mrs. White also took Lucy with her when she left." Allan laughed bitterly again. This was exactly something Cynthia would do. She couldn't bear to leave the dog he bought, but she could leave him. He really was less than a dog. It was the third day I had been staying at my best friend Corin's place. Seeing that I was still in a low mood, she dragged me out to eat hot pot. We strolled around the mall and bought a few new dresses. I had lost 5 lbs in 3 days, and my waist had slimmed down, but thankfully, my bust hadn't shrunk. Corin circled around me twice, clicking her tongue in admiration. "Our little beauty is still so gorgeous. You could squeeze water out of her. Don't be sad over an old man. Tonight I'll treat you to something fresh and energizing." Corin took me to a newly opened bar, but I wasn't in high spirits. After drinking half a cocktail in silence, Corin urged me to get up and dance. I was about to refuse when a clear male voice suddenly sounded behind me. "Cynthia?" I instinctively turned around and saw Peter Cox standing there. "Peter, you're back. In the country?" "Yeah, just got back the day before yesterday." Peter smiled as he walked over. "I was thinking of contacting you these days. Didn't expect to run into you." "Peter, aren't you going to introduce us?" one of Peter's classmates asked. "Yeah, such a pretty girl," another added. Peter's smile deepened as he walked to my side and naturally put his hand on my shoulder. "This is Cynthia Walsh, the junior I often mention to you. Cynthia, these are my classmates from abroad. You can just call them seniors." I was about to greet them politely when Corin suddenly bumped into me hard. I blinked in confusion, but then I followed her gaze in the dim light of the bar. There, standing not far from me at the bar counter, was Allan. I was so taken aback when I saw him. He was tall, dressed in a sleek black business suit, with a matching coat draped over his shoulders. Among the crowd of stylish young people, he stood out in a way that made me feel small. He stood there silently, his cold gaze fixed on me. It took a moment for me to snap out of it, and then I quickly stepped aside, trying to avoid Peter's hand on my shoulder. For some reason, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the thought that Allan might be angry. Whenever he was angry, I knew I was in trouble, especially if he took off his watch with that cold expression. That always meant I was done, for Peter looked concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing I didn't look well. He reached out to touch my forehead, but I hurriedly stepped back, nearly tripping over a chair. Peter caught me just in time, holding me by the waist to steady me. But before I could process what was happening, I felt someone grab my wrist. A strong pull, and suddenly, I was in Allan's arms. His eyes scanned me coldly, lingering on the V-neck of my dress. I tensed, frowning as I tried to push him away, but he was quicker, wrapping his coat around me. "I don't want your coat," I snapped, glaring at him and about to throw it off. But Allan held me down with one hand, his voice low as he leaned in, his breath brushing past my ear. "Cynthia Walsh, I'm just too soft-hearted with you." I froze, looking into his eyes, which now held a terrifying possessiveness. I felt like I was being consumed by a beast, and I knew there was nothing I could do to escape it. I had always been passive in his presence, always ordinary and insignificant. But tonight, as the fear inside me grew, so did the sense of grievance. I blinked back tears that threatened to fall, and just as they did, Allan wiped them away with a raised hand. "We'll settle this when we get home," he said coldly, stepping forward and shielding me from Peter. "Corin, I'll take Cynthia home first." "You guys have fun," Allan said, his tone final. Corin gave me a look that said, "Good luck," and I followed him silently. Allan's arm was wrapped around my waist, guiding me away. Peter called out to him, but Allan barely acknowledged him, a cold indifference in his gaze. "Mr. Cox, is there something you need?" Allan's voice was sharp. Peter seemed unfazed but clearly irritated, his face darkening. "It seems Cynthia doesn't want to go home with you," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. Allan's response was cutting. "Matters between my wife and me are none of your business. When Cynthia and I got married, you didn't even qualify for an invitation." Peter's expression changed, and before he could say anything else, Allan grabbed my wrist and started walking away. I struggled to keep up with his fast pace. In the past, Allan would slow down to match mine, but tonight, he was furious, and I could feel it. Once we reached the car, I finally managed to pull my wrist from his grasp. "Allan White, I've decided to divorce you, so my matters are none of your business," I snapped. "I don't need you to care." Allan gave a cold laugh. "So you're making a fuss because of Peter Cox? What does Peter have to do with this?" His words cut through me, and before I could respond, he accused me again. "You're cozying up to Peter Cox at a bar. Which of these words aren't true?" The anger inside me boiled over. "I'm the villain here? You're the one twisting the facts." I was so angry I could barely hold it in. Allan's gaze grew even colder. "You're asking for a divorce for no reason. Yet here you are, having fun with Peter Cox. It's all your fault." I felt utterly deflated. "I'm not going back with you," I said firmly. "Sign the divorce papers, Allan, and we'll see each other at the Civil Affairs Bureau." I pulled his coat off and threw it at him, then turned away to leave. But Allan grabbed my wrist once again. "I won't sign the divorce papers," he said, his voice unyielding. I tried to free myself, but his grip was too strong, and I couldn't move. In frustration, I bit his wrist hard, but he didn't even flinch. Instead, he tightened his grip, practically dragging me into the car. I pounded on the window, but the car had already started moving. "This is kidnapping. I'll sue you," I yelled, but Allan only smirked, his tone dripping with cold amusement. "You might as well save your energy for later," he said. "You're going to need it." My heart sank. I couldn't believe how easily he could make me feel so powerless. As the car moved, I could feel his presence like a looming shadow, dominating everything. In the confined space, Allan leaned in, closer. "Instead of wasting your energy screaming, you should save it for the bed. After all, I think you're in for a tough night." I was stunned at his words, the realization of what he meant hitting me. "You're a beast, a pervert," I spat, unable to keep the disgust out of my voice. Allan just calmly adjusted his sleeve, the amusement in his eyes clear. "There's nothing wrong with being a beast and a pervert. It's far more interesting than a gentleman husband who only knows one position for 365 days, don't you think?" I fell silent, unable to retort. It was me who had refused to let go. Me who had insisted on turning off the lights. Me who had stuck to the same position night after night. And now, I could only stay quiet, knowing I had given him all the ammunition he needed. Allan had always been a man of his word. And sure enough, the moment we stepped into the bedroom, my nightmare began. The sofa in the master bedroom, which I had chosen for its textured fabric, soon left my knees red and sore. I couldn't help but sob, begging him to stop, but Allan showed no signs of relenting. "This is just the first time tonight," he said coldly, as if it meant nothing to him. I hated him. I hated him more than I had ever hated anyone. But he didn't care. He just gripped my jaw and forced me to face him, his eyes dark with a desire that terrified me. "Do you like Peter Cox?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Does he know how loving we've been? Or is it the boy from high school? Or maybe the hotel manager?" I shook my head, exhausted and defeated, too tired to deny anything anymore. I had never liked any other man. From the very beginning, I had secretly had a crush on him, but I no longer intended to tell him that. By the end of the night, my vision blurred as the lights and stars outside the window swayed, as if they were shattering into pieces. I begged him repeatedly, and somehow he coaxed me into calling him honey. Only then did Allan show me a bit of kindness. He lifted me from the carpet and placed me back on the bed. I was so drained I couldn't even open my eyes. I fell asleep the moment I closed them. When I woke up the next day, Allan was no longer in the room. The daylight was bright, and I checked my phone. Nearly 11 a.m. After washing up, I went downstairs and casually asked the servant where Allan was. "Mr. White left very early. Seemed like he had something urgent," she replied. "He left around 5:00 in the morning." I froze. My spoon paused midair as I read the messages from Mandy. There were screenshots of Dora's moments, posted at 6:00 a.m. The captions were all love quotes that made my teeth ache, things like, "Being there for you. Any time is better than jewels, houses, mountains of gold and silver." The photo showed steaming porridge, flowers, and cut fruits. Mandy had asked, "Does my cousin also have such warm moments?" Dora had replied with a shy emoji. Mandy's next message was a sarcastic one. "Cynthia Walsh, be sensible and give up. Your position. Dora is kind-hearted, but I'm not easy to mess with. Don't end up with nothing." I didn't feel very angry, though. I finished my food slowly and then replied to Mandy. "Even though she's divorced, she's not in a hurry. Why are you desperately seeking attention here?" After sending it, I blocked her. What a clown. I couldn't even stand having her in my contacts. Just as I was about to pack up and leave, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. When Allan stepped out, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly to myself. Successful people, regardless of gender, are masters of time management. Mr. White was especially good at it. He had tormented me all night, but still had the energy to deliver flowers, porridge, and warmth early in the morning. And now he was back again. I ignored him and walked. "Straight out. Cynthia," Allan called, stopping me. He looked a bit tired, pressing his temples. "Have lunch with me." "I just ate," I replied, glancing at him. "If you have time, remember to sign the divorce agreement." He looked at me for a moment without responding, and then handed me a delicate little box. "I apologize for missing our anniversary. I had prepared the gift long ago." I saw the understated, luxurious logo on the box, and my heart ached heavily. I had casually mentioned before how much I liked their jewelry. He actually remembered and took the time to get it. But I didn't reach out to take it. "The anniversary is long past," I said. Allan's face still looked as handsome as ever, and my heart fluttered, despite my efforts not to cry. Tears started to fall uncontrollably. His tie was still the one I had bought him, along with the tie clip, cufflinks, and belt. Everything. I had personally chosen. But when he wore them to meet Dora, didn't he feel any guilt or unease? "Stop fighting with me, okay?" Allan touched the top of my head, then lowered his head and gently kissed my forehead. The more gentle and accommodating, He was, the more my heart felt torn apart. His sudden change in attitude must have been because he felt guilty. "Don't cry, Cynthia," he whispered, wiping away the tears at the corner of my eye with his hand. But as his light kiss fell on my eye, I suddenly thought of the small mole at the corner of Dora's eye. Instinctively, I pushed him away hard and slapped him in the face. "Allan White, don't touch me. It's disgusting." The sound of the slap echoed loudly, and the servants in the house fell silent. The driver and secretary stood off to the side, not daring to breathe. Allan stood still, emotionless, and simply looked at me calmly. He studied me for a full half-minute before speaking slowly. "If you've really decided to divorce, I respect your decision. I will sign the papers tomorrow." After finishing his sentence, he took off his coat and handed it to me. "It's snowing. Put this on." I stiffly reached out to take it, and as soon as I did, he let go, turned around, and got into the car. The car quickly drove away. The snow began to fall heavily, and I held the heavy coat, feeling my heart empty. The ground was covered in white, everything silent, yet I could hear the sound of my tears shattering. From this moment on, I knew that Allan White and I were completely over. The next morning, at 10 Sanin, I received a call from Allan's secretary. "Madam, Mr. White has signed the papers. When would it be convenient for you?" I rubbed my sore throat, the fever making me feel weak and exhausted, but I forced myself out of bed. "I'm available now," I said, coughing heavily. "I'll go to the Civil Affairs Bureau now." "Madam, there's a section in the agreement that Mr. White said needs further discussion. Where is he now?" I asked. "At the office," came the reply. "Then I will go to his office now." After taking some ibuprofen, I wrapped myself in a down jacket and went downstairs. When I arrived at Allan's company building and was about to get out of the car, I saw Dora. She stepped out of a nanny car, wearing a beige cashmere coat and matching beret, her waist slim, and her walk graceful and steady in pointed high heels. She was a stunning beauty. I smiled bitterly to myself. Allan probably didn't want to wait a minute longer, so he had Dora brought over immediately. The fever was making me miserable, and I didn't have the energy to think about their affairs. I just wanted to sign the papers, finish the formalities, and then go home to sleep for 3 days and nights. As I followed Allan's secretary into the private elevator, I heard murmuring behind me. Wasn't Secretary Vince picking up Mrs. White? What are they talking about? Just now, the one who went up earlier is the real Mrs. White, they said. Of course, only someone as beautiful as Dora deserves Allan. I wasn't angry. After all, it was true. Dora was a stunning beauty, and here I was, just an ordinary woman. I entered Allan's office, which took up the entire 27th floor, and it was as warm as always. I usually liked him in a white shirt, but he rarely wore them, preferring darker colors. But right now, I didn't have the energy to appreciate his appearance. Allan didn't even acknowledge me. I sat on the sofa, feeling the weight of the illness in my body, my throat sore, and I couldn't stop coughing. Allan noticed. "Are you sick?" he asked, offering me a tissue. I thanked him, but then he touched my forehead, his expression suddenly turning serious. "You're burning up," he said, walking over to his desk to make a call. "Get Dr. Foster up." "Here," he instructed. I tried to refuse, insisting I had already taken medicine, but before I could finish, another coughing fit seized me. My throat felt like it was being sliced, and my lungs ached. "Your symptoms won't go away just with medicine," Allan insisted. "Go lie down, and Dr. Foster will give you an IV." "No need," I said, brushing off his hand. "Let's talk about the divorce agreement first." He looked frustrated. "Cynthia, stop being childish," he warned, clearly upset. I gave up, shrugging and saying, "This is me, immature and clueless." But despite the tension, He didn't argue back. "You're sick," he sighed. "We'll talk after you see the doctor." "Why bother?" I smiled, holding back the tears. "Don't waste your time or keep others waiting." Before I could say anything more, there was a knock at the door. Secretary Vince entered with Dr. Foster. They took my temperature. It was still high, but I refused the IV, only asking Dr. Foster to prescribe some medicine. Once they left, I turned back to Allan. "What's going on with the divorce agreement?" He handed me the paperwork. My eyes immediately went to the section circled in red, custody of Lucy. Panic gripped me. We'd agreed that Lucy would be mine. Before I could speak, another coughing fit racked my body. Allan handed me water with one hand, opening a bottle of cough syrup with the other. "Drink this first," he said gently. I took the syrup and then grabbed his sleeve, pleading, "You bought Lucy for me. You said it was a gift." Allan calmly closed the syrup bottle and said, "Yes, Lucy was a wedding gift, but if we divorce, I have the right to take her back." His words felt like a blow. "You can't just take back a gift. You can't take Lucy from me," I cried. My heart shattered. "You can have everything else, but not her." Allan's face hardened. "This is non-negotiable. Lucy is mine." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to leave, but just then, the door opened. Dora entered with her soft, charming voice. "Is it a bad time? I've been waiting forever." She looked at me, her surprise quickly masked by a tender look at Allan. "I'll wait outside," she added, looking at him sweetly before leaving. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Don't make her wait," I spat, pointing to the door. "Sign the papers, Allan. Let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau and get this over with." "Don't be ridiculous," he frowned. "This is between us. Don't drag others into it." I laughed bitterly, my voice trembling with frustration. "Can you stop being so hypocritical? If you're not going to acknowledge it, then don't waste my time." Allan seemed taken aback, and I stood my ground. "Lucy is mine. But if you truly care about her, treat her well with your future wife." I turned to leave, but Allan stopped me, blocking the door. "Explain yourself." I didn't look at him. "On our first anniversary, your phone was unreachable. All night. Where were you? Who were you with?" His silence only fueled my anger. "That night, Dora called you. I heard it with my own ears. You said you were on your way and she told you to drive slowly." I didn't wait for his response and continued. "Dora is right next door. If you won't admit it, should I ask her to?" "Confront you?" Allan seemed cornered, and he opened the office door. "Come with me." I followed him into the next room, where Dora's voice greeted us with unhidden joy. "Allan, you're here," she said, before turning to me with an awkward look. "Is something wrong, Miss Walsh?" Her face went pale, her eyes avoiding mine. She forced a smile and spoke. "You've been quite busy since I returned to the country. I came to discuss a project." I wasn't fooled. "Dora, today is the first time we've met." Dora's expression faltered, and after a pause, she smiled weakly. "Yes, of course. Allan and I have always been good friends." She glanced at Allan and then at me, clearly trying to undermine me. "Cynthia, Miss Walsh? Look at her, still like a little child." I didn't waste time. I pulled out my phone and played a recording. "Aren't you Allan's little wife, Cynthia Walsh? Doesn't look much like you, though. If anything, it's her good fortune." "By the way, Dora," I said as calmly as I could, "when is my cousin coming over? I'll call and ask." I smiled as I finished, ready to make them uncomfortable. I pressed play on the recording again, and each time, Dora's face paled more. By the end, she could barely keep her composure. "This is fake. It's all fake. She must have used software to make it," Dora stammered, but her face was flushed red with embarrassment. Whether it's real or fake can be verified, and isn't Mandy a witness? I shot back. I showed Allan the screenshots and messages Mandy had sent me. Mandy had been causing trouble for so long, and I had put up with her for too long. I used to think Allan and Dora had an affair, and I wanted a divorce just to get away from all the mess. But now, with everything starting to unravel, I needed to reevaluate everything, especially when it came to Allan and Dora's relationship. Allan looked at the messages, his expression growing colder with every passing second. Finally, he let out a cold laugh. Seems like she's had enough of her comfortable life, Cynthia. I'll deal with Mandy, but we need to clear up a few things. He paused, then continued. Dora and I are just longtime friends. There's no truth to her being a substitute for you. And no, I didn't receive a call from her that night. It's likely fake. The person she mentioned in the post isn't me. You know very well I don't have the energy to comfort anyone early in the morning. I glanced at Dora, whose face was now ashen. Dora started to sweat, trying to explain. I didn't say anything. Mandy misunderstood. I didn't have time to clarify. I looked at her blankly. You caused this mess. You deal with it. I turned around and walked out of the room, determined not to waste any more time. Allan called after me. Where are you going? I feel really uncomfortable. I'm going back. Back where? Definitely not to the wedding room, I shot back. Allan seemed to accept that. I'll have the driver take you home, you're sick. Once I got home, I turned off my phone and went straight to bed. When I woke up, my fever was gone and I felt incredibly refreshed. Lucy was curled up next to me, drooling in her sleep. I couldn't help but laugh at her silly face. I cooked some noodles, ate until I was full, and then checked my phone. There were calls from Corin and Peter Cox, but most were from Allan. I ignored them all except Corin. Cynthia, you finally woke up. If you didn't turn on your phone soon, your man was going to break down the door, Corin said, just as the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw Allan standing outside, Mandy beside him, looking pitiful with a swollen face, crying. Before I could speak, she began apologizing. Cynthia, I'm so sorry. I won't dare cause trouble again. Dad already punished me. My cousin punished me too. Can you talk to my brother and ask him not to send me to Africa? I couldn't help but laugh at her now that she was looking so pitiful. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook. She had made my life miserable, and now she needed to learn a lesson. Sorry, but I hold grudges, I said coldly. After Allan had someone take Mandy away, he turned to me. Mandy needs to learn a lesson. As for what happened with Dora, let me explain. She came back to use my name for business deals. She's been scamming people, and Mandy got used in the process. I know her ex-husband. We've been friends since elementary school. I was shocked. So, all of this, the misunderstanding, the recording, everything. Cynthia, can you use your brain a little more before jumping to conclusions? Allan said, frustration creeping into his voice. I looked away, feeling guilty. I'm sorry. I was afraid. He softened. Afraid of what? Afraid that you didn't really love me. I thought maybe you married me out of obligation, not because you actually wanted me. Allan seemed frustrated. Do you think if I had someone else I wouldn't marry her and marry you instead? You're so hard on yourself. Tears welled up in my eyes as I quietly said, I thought maybe I wasn't enough for you. I'm plain, ordinary, and from a single-parent family. I never thought you'd love me, and hearing about Dora only confirmed my fears. Cynthia, if I had someone else, I wouldn't have married you. I love you. Don't doubt me, he said, firmly. I lowered my gaze, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. Let's not make this a bigger issue than it already is, all right? He said. But one thing, You have to stop meeting Peter Cox." "Are you jealous?" I asked, half laughing. He didn't respond immediately, but just grabbed my chin and kissed me deeply. "I believe you. But can you promise me you won't meet him again?" I felt my heart flutter and nodded. "I promise." Then, with a mischievous grin, Allan pulled me toward the bed. I blushed, but before we could go any further, he asked, "Do you still want to return me?" I bit my lip, refusing to answer. He kissed me, his touch lingering as he brushed away a strand of hair from my chest. I couldn't resist anymore. And as he kissed me again, I whispered, "No returns, Allan." He kissed my tears away, lingering on the small mole near my eye. And in that moment, I made a silent wish in my heart. May this love never end. May Allan and I stay together forever. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like these only at StoryTimes.